The Eiffel Tower glittered behind me as I adjusted my phone camera, the golden hour light casting everything in a dreamy glow. My heart was racing, not from the climb up to Trocadero, but from what I was about to do. For 26 years, I'd lived my life according to other people's plans, other people's fears, other people's limitations. But as I stood there in Paris, a city I was supposedly never meant to see, I knew everything was about to change. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I took a deep breath and hit a record. My name is Madison Brooks, and 3 days ago, my aunt believed she had successfully sabotaged my trip to Paris by hiding my passport. She thought she was protecting our family's reputation, maintaining control, keeping me safely tucked away in small-town Minnesota where I belonged. What she didn't know was that I had applied for an emergency passport replacement the moment I discovered what she'd done. What she couldn't have predicted was that her betrayal would become the catalyst for the biggest transformation of my life, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up here, posting photos from the City of Light while my family frantically tried to reach me, you need to know how deeply I'd buried my own dreams to keep everyone else comfortable. I grew up in Millbrook, Minnesota. Population 3,847, where everyone knew everyone and nothing much ever changed. My parents, Robert and Linda Brooks, ran the local hardware store that had been in our family for 3 generations. They were good people, hardworking and honest. But their world was small and they liked it that way. Travel was something other people did, something you saw on television or read about in magazines. When I was 8 years old, my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, showed us a documentary about the Louvre Museum. I became obsessed. I checked out every book about Paris our tiny library had, learned basic French phrases from a dusty language learning cassette, and covered my bedroom walls with pictures of Gothic cathedrals and sidewalk cafes. I announced to anyone who would listen that I was going to live in France someday. My parents smiled indulgently at what they assumed was a phase. But Aunt Diane, my father's older sister, was less amused. Diane had never married, never moved away from Millbrook, and had appointed herself the family's voice of reason and tradition. She lived just 2 blocks from us in the house where she and my father had grown up, and she had opinions about everything, especially about what was appropriate for the Brooks family. "Madison's getting too big for her britches," she would say, when she thought I couldn't hear all this nonsense about France. "She needs to learn to appreciate what she has right here." By high school, my dreams had evolved but not disappeared. I planned to study international business, maybe work for a company with European offices. I saved every dollar from my part-time job at the local cafe, putting it toward what I secretly called my Paris fund. I applied to colleges with strong study abroad programs, my applications carefully hidden from family scrutiny. Then my father had his heart attack during my senior year. It wasn't fatal, but it was serious enough to require surgery and months of recovery. The hardware store, our family's livelihood, couldn't run itself. My acceptance letters arrived while Dad was still in the hospital, but suddenly college felt like an impossible luxury. "We need you here, sweetheart," Mom said, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "Just for a year or 2, until Dad's back on his feet." Aunt Diane was more direct. "This is what family does, Madison. We take care of each other. All that college nonsense can wait." So I stayed. I deferred my acceptance, told my friends I'd join them the following year, and threw myself into keeping the hardware store afloat. I learned inventory management, customer service, bookkeeping. I discovered I was actually good at business. Finding ways to increase efficiency and boost sales that impressed even my skeptical aunt. 1 year became 2, then 3. Dad recovered fully, but by then I'd become indispensable. The store was more profitable than it had ever been under my management. My college friends had moved on with their lives, making new friends, pursuing internships, studying abroad. I watched their adventures unfold on social media while I rang up purchases of fertilizer and paint. "You're so lucky you stayed home," Aunt Diane would say. "Look how well things worked out. The store is thriving, your parents are proud, and you're not drowning in student debt like those other kids." I told myself she was right. I found ways to travel vicariously through travel blogs and YouTube channels. I learned to cook French cuisine from online tutorials, turning our small apartment above the store into my own little piece of Europe. I convinced myself that dreams were for other people, that contentment was more realistic than adventure, but contentment was a fragile thing, and it began to crack on my 25th birthday. My parents threw me a small party at the store, inviting our regular customers and a few family friends. The cake was from the grocery store, decorated with pink roses and "Happy Birthday Madison" in blue frosting. Everyone gathered around as I opened presents, practical things like a new winter coat and a coffee maker for the apartment, Then Mrs. Patterson, my old fourth-grade teacher, now retired and gray-haired, pulled me aside. She pressed a small wrapped package into my hands. With a conspiratorial wink. Inside was a guidebook to Paris, the latest edition, filled with colorful photographs and detailed maps. A note fell out as I opened it: "Some dreams are worth waiting for, but not worth waiting forever. The world is still there, Madison." I managed to smile and thank her, but that night I sat in my apartment, flipping through the guidebook and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, a deep, aching longing. The Eiffel Tower looked exactly as magical as it had in my childhood imagination. The Seine curved through the city like a ribbon of possibility. The cafes and museums and tree-lined boulevards called to something fundamental in my soul. That's when I started planning in earnest. Not just dreaming, but actually planning. I researched flights, hotels, visa requirements. I calculated exactly how much money I'd need for a 2-week trip. I had enough saved, more than enough, actually. 8 years of careful budgeting and minimal expenses had left me with a substantial nest egg. I decided to make it my 26th birthday gift to myself. Paris in the spring, just like in all the movies. I would book the trip 6 months in advance, giving myself time to prepare and giving my family time to adjust to the idea. I imagined their surprise when I announced my plans, their eventual support for my long-delayed adventure. I was naive to think it would be that simple. The explosion came 3 weeks after I'd secretly booked my flight and hotel. I'd been planning to tell my family over Sunday dinner, had even prepared a little speech about how much the trip meant to me and how I'd make sure the store was covered in my absence. But Aunt Diane beat me to it. "Madison's been acting strange lately," she announced as we sat around my parents' dining table. "Secretive. I saw her looking at some foreign travel website at the store the other day." My stomach dropped. I'd been careful, but small towns have a way of making privacy impossible. "Madison?" Mom looked concerned. "Is everything okay?" I should have been honest then. Should have explained my plans, my dreams, my need to finally see the world beyond Millbrook. Instead, I panicked and lied. "Just browsing," I said with a forced laugh. "You know, daydreaming." But Aunt Diane wasn't satisfied. Over the following weeks, she became increasingly suspicious, asking pointed questions about my savings account, my work schedule, and my sudden interest in checking my passport expiration date. She appointed herself my unofficial guardian, dropping by the store more frequently, monitoring my computer usage, even going through my mail when she thought I wasn't looking. The surveillance might have been comical if it hadn't been so suffocating. I felt like a teenager again, except I was 26 years old and running a successful business. The weight of her scrutiny, combined with my parents' growing concern about my restlessness, made me more determined than ever to take this trip. 2 months before my departure date, I finally worked up the courage to tell them. I chose a quiet evening when the store was closed and we were all having dinner together. I'd rehearsed my speech, prepared answers to their inevitable objections, steeled myself for their disappointment. "I have something to tell you all," I began, my heart hammering. "I've booked a trip to Paris. I leave in 2 months." The silence was deafening. Mom's fork clattered to her plate. Dad stopped chewing mid-bite. Aunt Diane's face went through several colors before settling on a deep red. "You what?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper. "Paris, France," I continued, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've wanted to go since I was a child. I have the money saved, I've made arrangements for the store to be covered, and I've already bought my ticket." "Without discussing it with us?" Dad's tone was hurt more than angry. "Madison, we're a family. We make decisions together. Especially decisions that affect the business," Aunt Diane added sharply. "The store needs you. We all need you. This is incredibly selfish." The word selfish hit me like a slap. After 8 years of putting everyone else's needs first, after sacrificing my college dreams and my youth for the family business, I was being called selfish for wanting 2 weeks in Paris. "I'm 26 years old," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I've worked in this store for 8 years without taking a real vacation. I've put my entire life on hold for this family. 2 weeks in Paris is not unreasonable. 2 weeks in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, don't know anyone, and anything could happen," Mom said, her maternal anxiety taking over. "Madison, honey, why don't we plan a nice trip somewhere closer? Maybe Chicago, or even New York?" But it wasn't about the trip. It was about the principle. It was about finally, after years of accommodation and compromise, doing something purely for myself. "I don't want to go to Chicago," I said firmly. "I want to go to Paris. I've earned this trip, I can afford this trip, and I'm going on this trip." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The argument that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. Voices were raised, tears were shed, and ultimatums were issued. Aunt Diane threatened to find someone else to manage the store if I couldn't be relied upon. Mom worried aloud about what people in town would think. Dad, caught between his sister and his daughter, tried unsuccessfully to mediate. In the end, they extracted a promise from me to think it over for a few more weeks. I agreed, hoping that time would help them come to terms with my decision. I should have known better. 3 days before my flight, I went to my dresser drawer where I always kept my important documents. My passport wasn't there. I searched frantically through every drawer, every box, every possible hiding place in my small apartment. Nothing. That's when I found the note, written in Aunt Diane's distinctive handwriting and tucked where my passport should have been. Some dreams are meant to stay dreams. You'll thank me for this someday. Standing there in my ransacked apartment, holding that condescending note, something fundamental shifted inside me. For 8 years, I'd been the good daughter, the responsible niece, the reliable employee. I'd swallowed my disappointment, suppressed my dreams, and convinced myself that self-sacrifice was the same thing as love, but this wasn't love. This was control, manipulation, and theft. And I was done. I called the passport office first, then the airlines, then a travel agent who specialized in emergency travel situations. Yes, I could get an emergency passport replacement. Yes, my flight could be moved back by 3 days. Yes, my hotel reservation could be adjusted. It would cost extra, and it would be stressful, but it was absolutely possible. As I made call after call, arranging and rearranging my trip, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, undiluted determination. Aunt Diane had made a critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that hiding my passport would end my plans. Instead, it had removed any lingering guilt I felt about disappointing my family. I didn't tell them about the emergency passport. I didn't announce my adjusted travel plans. I simply went to work those next few days as if nothing had happened, playing the part of the defeated daughter who had finally learned her place. The morning I left for Paris, I was scheduled to open the store as usual. Instead, I left a letter on the counter explaining that I would be gone for 2 weeks, that I'd arranged temporary coverage, and that when I returned, we would need to have a serious conversation about boundaries and respect. Then I drove to Minneapolis, caught my flight, and spent the longest travel day of my life thinking about all the years I'd wasted trying to be the person other people wanted me to be. Now here I was, 3 days later, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower with my phone in my hand and my family's frantic voicemails filling my inbox. I hadn't answered a single call. I hadn't responded to the increasingly panicked text messages. For 3 glorious days, I'd been completely unreachable, and it had been the most liberating experience of my life, but now it was time to let them know where I was. Not to ask permission, not to apologize, but to show them that their attempts to control me had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly. I positioned my phone to capture both my smiling face and the iconic tower behind me. The golden hour light was perfect, making everything look like a dream come true. Which, I realized, was exactly what this was. "Hi, family," I said to the camera, my voice steady and confident. "I'm calling from Paris." The Brooks family had deep roots in Millbrook, Minnesota, stretching back to my great-grandfather, Samuel Brooks, who'd arrived from Pennsylvania in 1952 with nothing but a toolbox and an unshakable belief in hard work. He'd opened Brooks Hardware and Supply in a cramped storefront on Main Street, selling everything from nails to farm equipment to the growing community of families seeking the promise of small-town life. By the time I was born in 1997, the store had become a local institution. 3 generations of Brooks men had expanded it, modernized it, and turned it into the kind of place where farmers came for advice as much as supplies, where homeowners trusted our recommendations completely, and where credit was still extended on a handshake. It was honest work, respectable work, and according to my family, it was enough. My earliest memories involve the familiar sounds of the store, the jingle of the bell above the front door, the scratching of pencils on order forms, the satisfying thunk of the old cash register. While other children spent their after-school hours at playgrounds or in front of televisions, I was stacking paint cans, organizing nuts and bolts, and learning to count change. It wasn't a burden then, it was simply the rhythm of our lives. My mother Linda had grown up in Millbrook too, the daughter of the town's only dentist. She'd met my father at a church social when they were both 19, married him 2 years later, and seamlessly integrated herself into the Brooks legacy. She managed the store's books with meticulous precision, handled customer service with genuine warmth, and never once expressed any desire for a life beyond the boundaries of our small town. "We have everything we need right here," she would say whenever I questioned why we never traveled, why we never explored beyond the familiar borders of central Minnesota. Family, community, purpose. What more could anyone want? For years, I accepted this philosophy without question. Millbrook was safe, predictable, comfortable. Everyone knew everyone, which meant you were never truly alone but also never truly anonymous. Mrs. Henderson at the post office knew when you received packages from distant relatives. Pastor Williams knew when families were struggling financially. Dr. Garrett knew everyone's medical history and their family's medical history going back decades. Aunt Diane fit perfectly into this ecosystem. 5 years older than my father, she'd established herself as the unofficial keeper of family standards and community expectations. She taught second grade at Millbrook Elementary for 37 years, shaping generations of local children. With her firm hand and unwavering belief in traditional values. She knew which families attended church regularly, which teenagers were getting into trouble, and which young people had ideas above their station. Her house, the house where she and my father had grown up, sat like a sentinel 2 blocks from ours. It was a modest 2-story with white siding and blue shutters, surrounded by a garden that she maintained with military precision. Every morning at exactly 7:15, she would walk to the corner store for her newspaper and coffee, greeting neighbors by name and noting any changes to their routines or properties. "Diane sees everything," my mother would say, though whether this was a complaint or an admiration was never quite clear. What Aunt Diane saw in our family was potential for disappointment. She'd witnessed the destruction that unrealistic expectations could wreak, having taught countless children who dreamed of becoming astronauts, movie stars, or professional athletes, only to settle into the same patterns as their parents. She'd seen young people leave Millbrook for college or careers in distant cities, only to return years later, defeated and debt-ridden, grateful to find work at the grain elevator or the county courthouse. Madison's got too much imagination for her own good, she would tell my parents during family dinners, usually after I'd shared some story from school about distant places or different cultures. Someone needs to help her understand the difference between fantasy and reality. My parents, caught between their sister's practical wisdom and their daughter's obvious intelligence, tried to strike a balance. They encouraged my academic achievements, while gently steering me toward practical applications. When I excelled in math, they suggested I might enjoy managing the store's inventory. When I showed aptitude for languages, they pointed out how useful Spanish might be for communicating with the growing Latino population in neighboring counties. The first crack in this carefully constructed worldview came during my freshman year of high school, when our English teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, assigned a project on cultural exploration. We were supposed to research a country we'd never visited and present our findings to the class. While most of my classmates chose nearby places like Canada or Mexico, I was drawn immediately to France. I spent weeks diving into research, discovering not just the obvious tourist attractions but the intricate details of daily French life. I learned about the café culture, where people would spend hours discussing philosophy over tiny cups of coffee. I read about the French education system, which valued intellectual curiosity and critical thinking. I discovered French literature, French cinema, French approaches to art and food and conversation that seemed to prize complexity and nuance over the straightforward practicality I'd grown up with. My presentation was a revelation, not just to my classmates but to myself. Standing in front of the classroom, explaining the significance of French Impressionist painting or the cultural importance of leisurely meals, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of belonging to something larger than Millbrook. Something more intellectually stimulating than hardware sales. Mr. Rodriguez noticed my enthusiasm and began recommending books, documentaries, and online resources that fed my growing fascination with international cultures. He'd lived in 7 different countries before settling in Minnesota to raise his family, and he understood the pull of distant places in ways my family couldn't comprehend. "Curiosity about the world isn't a character flaw, Madison," he told me after class one day. "It's a sign of intelligence and empathy. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." But at home, my expanding interests were viewed with increasing concern. Aunt Diane monitored my library checkouts, noting with disapproval the travel guides and foreign language materials. She questioned my parents about my obsession with places and people so far removed from our own experiences. "She's 15 years old," Aunt Diane declared during one particularly tense family dinner. "This is exactly the age when young people start getting rebellious ideas. We need to redirect her energy toward something productive." The redirection took the form of increased responsibilities at the store. My after-school hours became consumed with inventory management, customer service training, and bookkeeping basics. My parents framed it as valuable life experience, teaching me skills that would serve me well regardless of my future path. But I recognized it for what it really was, an attempt to anchor me so firmly to the family business that leaving would become unthinkable. Despite their efforts, my junior and senior years were marked by increasingly detailed planning for my escape. I researched colleges with strong international business programs, calculated the costs of studying abroad, and secretly took online courses to improve my French language skills. I applied for every scholarship available, working nights and weekends to build an impressive application portfolio. The irony wasn't lost on me that my dedication to planning my departure made me a better employee at the store. The organizational skills, attention to detail, and customer service experience I was gaining would serve me well in any career. But my family saw only the practical benefits, not understanding that every skill I developed was another step toward independence. My acceptance to the University of Minnesota's Carlson School of Management arrived on a gray March afternoon during my senior year. The thick envelope contained not just an acceptance letter but notification of a partial scholarship and information about their highly competitive study abroad programs. For the first time in my life, I could see a clear path from Millbrook to Paris, from the hardware store to an international career. I hid the letter for 3 days, carrying it with me like a secret talisman while I worked up the courage to share the news. When I finally gathered my family in our living room to make the announcement, I expected surprise, maybe some concern, but ultimately support for my achievement. Instead, I encountered a wall of resistance that caught me completely off guard. College is expensive, honey, my mother said immediately. Have you really thought through the financial implications? The store needs someone reliable to help with modernization, my father added. We've been planning to upgrade our computer systems, expand our online presence. You'd be perfect for that. But it was Aunt Diane's response that cut deepest. Madison, I've seen dozens of young people from this town chase dreams they couldn't afford, pursue careers they weren't suited for, move to cities that chewed them up and spit them out. Is that really what you want? To throw away everything this family has built for some fantasy about living in Europe? The word fantasy stung because part of me worried she might be right. I'd never been farther from home than Minneapolis. I'd never lived independently, never navigated a big city, never tested myself against the kind of challenges that college and international travel would present. What if I was being naive? What if my dreams were bigger than my capabilities? These doubts were amplified by the practical realities my family presented. College was expensive, even with the scholarship. The store was indeed struggling with technological upgrades that my computer skills could address. My parents were aging, and the physical demands of running a hardware store were becoming more challenging for them. Just defer for a year, my mother suggested. Help us get the store updated and running smoothly. College will still be there next year. It seemed reasonable. It seemed responsible. It seemed like the kind of compromise that mature, family-oriented people made. So I agreed, telling myself that 1 year of delay wouldn't significantly impact my long-term plans. The deferral letter was the first step down a path I hadn't intended to take. Within weeks of graduation, I was working full-time at the store, learning advanced inventory management, developing customer relationships, and tackling the technological upgrades that had seemed so urgent. I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for retail management, an intuitive understanding of customer needs, and an ability to streamline operations that impressed everyone, including myself. You're a natural at this, my father said proudly, as I implemented a new ordering system that reduced waste and improved profit margins. Maybe college isn't necessary after all. The positive feedback was intoxicating after years of being told my interests were impractical. Here was concrete evidence of my capabilities, immediate recognition of my contributions, and a clear sense of purpose that didn't require leaving everything familiar behind. When my father's heart attack occurred 8 months later, my role at the store transformed from temporary help to essential leadership. The heart attack happened on a Tuesday morning in February. Dad had been moving a shipment of rock salt when he suddenly grabbed his chest and collapsed behind the counter. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but the drive to the regional hospital felt eternal. During those terrifying hours in the waiting room, the possibility of losing him made my college dreams seem selfish and insignificant. His recovery was successful but slow. Months of cardiac rehabilitation, dietary changes, and reduced physical activity meant he couldn't return to the demanding work of running the store. Mom, overwhelmed by medical appointments and insurance paperwork, couldn't manage both his care and the business operations. We don't know what we would have done without you, she told me tearfully as I balanced the books one evening while Dad napped in his recliner. You saved the store. You saved our family. The weight of that gratitude, combined with my genuine love for my parents and my growing competence at business management, made the decision to defer college for another year feel not just reasonable but heroic. I was the responsible daughter, the devoted family member, the young woman who understood that some things mattered more than personal ambitions, but even as I embraced this role, something essential was being slowly eroded. Each month that passed without concrete plans for college made the idea seem less realistic. Each improvement I made to the store's operations made my presence seem more necessary. Each compliment from customers or community members reinforced the narrative that I'd found my true calling right here in Millbrook. Aunt Diane, who had initially viewed my college acceptance with suspicion, now praised my maturity and family loyalty at every opportunity. She spoke glowingly to her friends about how I'd come to my senses and chosen responsibility over unrealistic dreams. Her approval, which I'd rarely earned before, became another thread binding me to the life I'd accidentally chosen. By the time my father was fully recovered and capable of returning to work, I'd become so integrated into the store's operations that my departure would have created genuine hardship. I'd developed relationships with suppliers, built trust with customers, and implemented systems that only I fully understood. Leaving would have felt like abandoning not just my family but the entire community that had come to depend on my expertise. Maybe this is what was meant to happen, I told myself as my second year of deferral stretched into a third. Maybe I was being naive about college and travel. Maybe this is actually a better life. It would take years for me to understand that good intentions and family loyalty had slowly constructed a cage around my dreams, one that felt so comfortable and necessary that I'd stopped noticing the bars. The third year slipped by like water through my fingers, each day indistinguishable from the last in a rhythm that felt both comforting and suffocating. I'd mastered the delicate dance of small-town retail, greeting the morning regulars with their preferred coffee orders ready before they asked, knowing which contractors needed supplies before they called, and anticipating seasonal demands with the precision of someone who'd observed these patterns for years. Mrs. Kowalski came in every Tuesday for birdseed and stayed to chat about her grandchildren. Frank Mueller arrived promptly at 8 each Saturday for his weekly hardware pilgrimage, methodically examining every new tool we'd received. The Henderson twins, now in their 70s, continued their decades-long debate about the superiority of different paint brands while purchasing identical supplies for their identical houses. These interactions, once charming glimpses into community life, began to feel like scenes from a play I'd been performing too long. I knew everyone's lines, anticipated every joke, and could predict each conversation before it began. The familiarity that had once made me feel secure now felt like a straitjacket, beautiful and well-intentioned but increasingly restrictive. My mornings started at 6:30 with inventory checks and supply deliveries. Afternoons brought the steady stream of contractors, homeowners, and farmers who relied on our expertise and stock. Evenings were spent updating computer systems, reconciling receipts, and planning for the next day's shipments. Somewhere in this carefully orchestrated routine, the days when I dreamed of cobblestone streets and museum corridors felt like memories from someone else's life. The erosion of my dreams wasn't dramatic or sudden. It happened incrementally, through 1,000 small accommodations and rationalizations. When my college friends shared photos from their study abroad programs, I convinced myself that their experiences looked stressful and expensive. When travel documentaries appeared on television, I found practical reasons to change the channel. When former classmates posted updates about internships in Chicago or Minneapolis, I reminded myself how much more stable and meaningful my work at the store was. This self-deception became easier as I developed genuine expertise in areas I'd never expected to master. I learned to identify problems with electrical systems by listening to customers describe symptoms. I could recommend the exact paint color needed to match a sample brought in by someone repainting a single room. I discovered that I had an intuitive understanding of spatial relationships that made me excellent at helping customers plan renovation projects. "Madison knows everything" became a common refrain among our clientele. If she can't help you, nobody can. The praise was addictive. After years of feeling like my interests were impractical and my dreams were naive, being recognized as an expert in something tangible and useful filled a void I hadn't realized existed. When the Millers thanked me for helping them avoid a costly plumbing mistake, or when the Johnsons credited my advice with saving their deck renovation, I felt a sense of accomplishment that no travel blog or language lesson had ever provided. But expertise in small-town retail came with its own chains. The more indispensable I became, the more impossible leaving seemed. My parents had learned to rely on my judgment for major purchasing decisions. Our suppliers knew me by name and trusted my orders without confirmation. Regular customers would wait if I wasn't available, preferring my recommendations to those of my father or the part-time employees we occasionally hired. "You've really found your calling," Aunt Diane would say with satisfaction whenever she stopped by the store. "I always knew you'd figure out where you belonged." Her approval, once so rare and therefore precious, now felt like another weight. She'd taken to bragging about my business acumen to her retired teacher friends, describing how I'd matured beyond my years and learned to appreciate real life instead of chasing fantasies. These compliments felt like obituaries for the person I'd once hoped to become. The fourth year brought new challenges that further entrenched my role as the store's backbone. A large home improvement chain opened in the county seat, 30 miles away, offering lower prices and broader selection than our family business could match. For the first time in its 70-year history, Brooks Hardware faced serious competition. My parents panicked. They'd weathered economic downturns, seasonal fluctuations, and changing customer preferences, but they'd never confronted the existential threat of corporate competition. Their first instinct was to cut costs by reducing inventory and eliminating services, a strategy that would have accelerated our decline into irrelevance. I spent sleepless nights researching retail competition strategies, studying how independent businesses could survive against big-box stores. I learned about niche marketing, customer service differentiation, and the importance of community connections that corporations couldn't replicate. My recommendations transformed our approach from reactive cost-cutting to proactive value addition. We began offering services the chain store couldn't provide: custom key cutting, small appliance repair, expert consultation on complex projects. I developed relationships with local contractors, offering professional discounts and job site delivery that saved them time and money. We hosted weekend workshops on home maintenance, gardening, and seasonal preparation that attracted customers who valued learning alongside purchasing. The strategy worked brilliantly. Our customer base stabilized, our profit margins improved, and our reputation as the knowledgeable alternative to impersonal big-box shopping grew throughout the region. Local newspapers wrote feature articles about our innovative approach to small-town retail. Business development organizations invited me to speak at conferences about competing with corporate chains. Madison Brooks has single-handedly revolutionized small-town commerce, proclaimed a headline in the Regional Business Journal. Her creative strategies prove that family businesses can thrive in the modern marketplace. The recognition was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Each award, each speaking engagement, each newspaper article felt like another nail in the coffin of my escape plans. How could I leave when the business needed me? How could I abandon the store when my innovations were being studied and replicated across the state? My parents glowed with pride at community events where local business leaders praised their daughter's intelligence and dedication. Dad would beam as he introduced me to visiting dignitaries or potential customers, describing how I'd saved the family business and brought modern thinking to traditional values. Mom collected every newspaper clipping and magazine mention, creating a scrapbook that documented my transformation from college-bound dreamer to small-town business success story. But success in Millbrook felt like failure to the person I'd once been. The girl who'd covered her bedroom walls with images of the Eiffel Tower now spent her walls covered with supplier catalogs and inventory schedules. The young woman who'd learned French phrases from library cassettes now spoke primarily in the technical vocabulary of hardware and home improvement. The teenager who dreamed of international adventures now found her greatest excitement in quarterly profit reports and customer satisfaction surveys. Social media became a form of torture. My college friends were graduating, starting careers in distant cities, traveling to places I'd only imagined. Sarah Chen was working for an international consulting firm with offices in London and Tokyo. Marcus Thompson had landed a position with a travel company that sent him to photograph destinations across Europe. Jennifer Walsh was teaching English in South Korea, posting images of temple visits and cultural festivals that looked like scenes from my abandoned dreams. I stopped following their accounts. I stopped checking the study abroad programs at universities I'd once hoped to attend. I stopped watching travel shows or reading about international news. The world beyond Millbrook became an abstraction, something that existed for other people but not for someone whose life was measured in quarterly inventory reports and customer service awards. The fifth year brought an unexpected test of my resignation to small-town life. Mr. Rodriguez, my former high school English teacher who'd first encouraged my interest in international cultures, returned to Millbrook for his mother's funeral. We encountered each other at the grocery store, and his shock at seeing me was impossible to disguise. "Madison Brooks," he said with genuine surprise. "I heard you were running the family store now. I thought for sure you'd be traveling the world by now." The conversation that followed was polite but painful. He told me about his recent sabbatical in France, where he'd spent 6 months teaching American literature at a university in Lyon. He described the experience with the kind of enthusiasm I remembered feeling when discussing my own French dreams, back when those dreams had seemed achievable rather than embarrassing. "You know," he said carefully, "it's never too late to pursue those interests. There are programs for adult learners, working professionals who want to experience other cultures. Your business experience would actually be valuable in international settings." I thanked him for the suggestion while explaining how essential my role at the store had become, how much my parents depended on me, how fulfilling I found my work in the community. The words sounded hollow even as I spoke them, but they were the truth I'd constructed to make my situation bearable. That night, alone in my apartment above the store, I allowed myself a few minutes of dangerous thinking. I opened my laptop and searched for adult education programs with international components. I found language immersion courses, cultural exchange programs, and business development opportunities that seemed designed exactly for someone with my background and interests. For a brief, reckless moment, I imagined myself in a Parisian cafe, speaking French with actual French people, discussing literature and art and ideas that had nothing to do with paint colors or electrical systems. I pictured myself walking along the Seine at sunset, visiting the Louvre on a quiet Tuesday morning, sitting in a sidewalk cafe watching the world pass by. Then I closed the laptop and returned to my inventory spreadsheets. Dreams were luxuries for people without responsibilities, fantasies for individuals who could afford to be selfish. I had work to do, bills to pay, a family business to protect. The girl who dreamed of Paris was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the difference between childish wishes and adult obligations. The 6th year arrived with a promotion that felt like a life sentence. My parents officially named me general manager of Brooks Hardware and Supply, with a salary increase, profit-sharing arrangement, and 5-year contract that made my position permanent in every sense except legal. The announcement appeared in the local newspaper with a photograph of 3 generations of Brooks family members standing proudly in front of the store. Madison Brooks represents the future of family business in rural America, the article proclaimed. Her innovative management has not only preserved a local institution but transformed it into a model for small-town entrepreneurship. The ceremony marking my promotion was held at the community center, attended by what seemed like half the town. Mayor Patterson presented me with a key to the city. The Chamber of Commerce gave me an award for business innovation. Aunt Diane stood at the podium and delivered a speech about how proud she was to see me fulfill my true potential and choose substance over fleeting dreams. As I smiled and posed for photographs, shook hands with well-wishers, and accepted congratulations from people who'd watched me grow up, I felt like I was attending my own funeral. The ambitious, world-curious girl I'd once been was being officially laid to rest, replaced by this competent, reliable, thoroughly domesticated version who'd learned to find satisfaction in profit margins and customer loyalty. The cage of good intentions, family expectations, and community approval had been completed. I was no longer someone who'd temporarily deferred her dreams. I was someone whose dreams had been successfully redirected toward more practical purposes. The transformation was complete, the erosion total, the surrender absolute. Or so I thought. Until a simple birthday gift would remind me that some dreams refuse to die, no matter how deeply they're buried. The Paris guidebook arrived on my 25th birthday like a message from a former life. Mrs. Patterson had wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, the kind of thoughtful presentation that suggested she understood the significance of what she was giving me. As I unwrapped it in the back office of the store, away from the family celebration happening in the main showroom, my hands trembled slightly at the sight of the familiar Eiffel Tower photograph on the cover. Some dreams are worth waiting for, but not worth waiting forever, her note had said. The world is still there, Madison. Those words hit me with unexpected force. The world is still there. In 7 years of managing the store, I'd somehow convinced myself that the opportunities I'd missed had disappeared permanently, that the window for adventure and exploration had closed when I'd chosen responsibility over dreams. But Mrs. Patterson was right. Paris hadn't moved, the museums hadn't closed, the cafes were still serving coffee to travelers from around the globe. That night, I sat in my small apartment above the store, the guidebook open on my kitchen table like forbidden literature. Each page revealed wonders I'd forgotten I'd once desperately wanted to see. The Gothic majesty of Notre Dame Cathedral. The artistic treasures of the Musée d'Orsay. The charming neighborhood of Montmartre with its winding cobblestone streets and sidewalk artists. The Latin Quarter with its bookshops and bistros where intellectuals had gathered for centuries to debate philosophy and literature. I'd become so thoroughly immersed in the practical demands of small-town retail that I'd forgotten how profoundly these places had once stirred my imagination. Reading about them now felt like recovering lost pieces of my identity. Fragments of the person I'd been before responsibility and family expectations had reshaped me into someone more acceptable, more predictable, more useful. The awakening wasn't immediate or dramatic. It began as a persistent ache, a growing awareness that the life I'd built, however successful and admired, wasn't the life I'd chosen so much as the life that had chosen me. Each morning as I unlocked the store and prepared for another day of helping customers with their home improvement projects, I found myself wondering what I might be doing instead if I'd followed the path I'd originally planned out. I started small, testing the waters of possibility. I downloaded a French language app on my phone, practicing pronunciation during quiet moments at the store. I began following travel bloggers on social media, carefully curating a feed that showed me glimpses of the world I'd abandoned. I subscribed to international news sources, reading about global events and cultural developments that had nothing to do with paint colors or electrical supplies. These activities felt simultaneously thrilling and dangerous. Each French phrase I learned was evidence of desires I was supposed to have outgrown. Each travel photograph I viewed was proof that I hadn't fully accepted the limitations of my small-town existence. Each article about international business or cultural exchange reminded me of career paths I might have pursued if I'd been braver, more selfish, more willing to disappoint the people who depended on me. The internal conflict intensified over the following months. During the day, I performed my role as the competent, dedicated store manager with practiced ease. I helped contractors plan complex projects, advised homeowners on seasonal maintenance, and maintained the customer relationships that kept our business thriving despite corporate competition. But in the evenings, I found myself increasingly restless, unable to focus on the television shows and community events that had once provided adequate entertainment. I began taking long drives through the Minnesota countryside, ostensibly to visit suppliers or scope out potential business opportunities, but really to escape the suffocating familiarity of Millbrook. These solo journeys became precious opportunities to imagine different versions of my life, to consider what might be possible if I had the courage to disappoint everyone who had grown comfortable with my reliability. The first concrete step toward change came 6 months after my birthday, when I quietly opened a separate savings account. I told myself it was just responsible financial planning, an emergency fund that any business owner should maintain. But as I transferred modest amounts from each paycheck, I knew I was really building what I'd once called my Paris fund. Money that could buy airplane tickets, hotel reservations, and the freedom to choose adventure over obligation. The secrecy was necessary because any dramatic change in my behavior would have triggered immediate family intervention. Aunt Diane possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect signs of restlessness or unrealistic thinking in her relatives. My parents, while less suspicious by nature, had learned to associate my international interests with periods of instability that threatened the store's operations. So I learned to compartmentalize, maintaining my public persona as the devoted daughter and successful business manager while privately nurturing the dreams I'd thought were dead. I researched travel requirements, learned about passport renewal procedures, and studied the logistics of taking extended time away from work. I discovered that the store could probably survive my temporary absence better than I'd assumed. Our systems had become efficient enough to run with minimal oversight, and my parents had more capability than they'd been allowed to demonstrate. In recent years, the planning process revealed how thoroughly I'd underestimated my own agency. For years, I'd told myself that leaving was impossible because the store needed me, because my parents couldn't manage without me, because the community depended on my expertise. But careful analysis showed that these justifications were partially self-serving, ways of avoiding the risks and uncertainties that came with pursuing long-deferred dreams. Yes, my departure would create temporary difficulties. Yes, it would require my parents to reassume responsibilities they'd gladly delegated to me. Yes, it would inconvenience customers who'd grown accustomed to my availability and knowledge. But none of these challenges were insurmountable, and none of them constituted valid reasons for permanently sacrificing my own aspirations. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. If my presence wasn't absolutely essential, then my continued residence in Millbrook was a choice rather than a necessity. And if it was a choice, then I could theoretically make a different one, but only if I was willing to accept the consequences of prioritizing my own desires over other people's expectations. The tipping point came during our annual family Christmas gathering, a tradition that brought together 3 generations of Brookses for an evening of gift exchange and community gossip. As usual, the conversation centered on local developments, store improvements, and Aunt Diane's observations about various neighbors and their activities. The topics that had once seemed comfortably familiar now felt claustrophobic, evidence of how narrow my world had become. When my cousin Derek announced that he'd accepted a job transfer to Denver, the family's reaction was tellingly mixed. While everyone expressed appropriate congratulations and promised to visit, I detected underlying disapproval in their questions about cost of living, distance from family, and the wisdom of leaving established roots for uncertain opportunities. Derek's always been impulsive, Aunt Diane confided to my mother later in the evening, her voice carrying clearly to where I was washing dishes in the kitchen. I just hope he doesn't regret giving up everything stable for some adventure that might not work out. The implication was clear: leaving Millbrook was inherently risky, inherently selfish, inherently inadvisable. People who chose uncertainty over security were to be pitted rather than admired, cautionary tales rather than examples of courage or ambition, but as I listened to Derek describe his excitement about exploring a new city, learning to ski in the Rocky Mountains, and experiencing a different pace of life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, envy so pure and sharp it was almost painful. He was 28 years old, exactly 3 years younger than me, and he was choosing adventure over comfort, possibility over predictability, personal growth over family expectations. If Derek could make such a choice, why couldn't I? The question haunted me through the new year as I returned to the familiar rhythms of store management and community involvement. But now these activities felt like performances rather than authentic expressions of my interests and values. I found myself going through the motions of contentment while privately counting the days until I could implement the plans that were slowly taking shape in my mind. The internet became my secret classroom, teaching me about travel planning, international business opportunities, and the practicalities of temporary expatriation. I learned about working visas, language immersion programs, and the growing field of cultural consulting that might allow me to combine my business experience with my international interests. I discovered online communities of people who'd made dramatic career changes in their 20s and 30s, individuals who'd left secure positions to pursue passions they'd thought were impractical. Their stories provided both inspiration and practical guidance, proving that major life transitions were not only possible but often led to more fulfilling and authentic lives. Most importantly, I began to understand that my fear of disappointing my family was actually a form of arrogance. I'd assumed that my happiness was less important than their comfort, that my dreams mattered less than their expectations, that my potential was secondary to their immediate needs. But this assumption implied that I was somehow obligated to live according to their vision of appropriate choices, that my life belonged to them rather than to me. The shift in perspective was gradual but fundamental. Instead of asking whether I had the right to pursue my own interests, I began asking whether anyone else had the right to prevent me from doing so. Instead of focusing on how my departure might inconvenience others, I considered how staying might be preventing me from becoming the person I was meant to be. By late spring, I'd accumulated enough savings for a substantial international trip and enough knowledge to plan it intelligently. I'd researched accommodations, transportation, and cultural etiquette. I'd improved my French to a conversational level and studied European business practices that might inform future career decisions. Most crucially, I'd developed the emotional infrastructure necessary to withstand family disapproval. The awakening that had begun with Mrs. Patterson's guidebook had evolved into genuine self-respect, a recognition that my dreams and ambitions were as valid as anyone else's, regardless of how impractical or selfish they might appear to people who'd never experienced similar longings. The decision to book the trip felt less like a rebellion than like a homecoming, a return to the authentic self I'd temporarily set aside but never completely abandoned. As I researched flights to Paris and calculated the logistics of a 2-week absence from the store, I felt something I hadn't experienced since high school: excitement about my own future. The girl who'd once covered her bedroom walls with photographs of the Eiffel Tower was still alive, buried under years of practical concerns and family obligations but not extinct. She was ready to reclaim her dreams, regardless of the cost, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the disappointment it might cause people who'd grown comfortable with her sacrifice. For the first time in nearly a decade, I was planning for my own happiness rather than everyone else's convenience. The awakening was complete. Now came the far more challenging task of acting on it. The booking confirmation email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, containing flight details that felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport, May 18. Departure 6:45 p.m. from Minneapolis-St. Paul International. 2 weeks in the city I'd dreamed about since childhood, staying in a small hotel in the Marais district that had received glowing reviews from solo female travelers. I stared at the confirmation number on my phone screen, a series of letters and digits that represented the most audacious decision I'd made in my adult life. This wasn't a tentative plan or a someday fantasy, it was a concrete commitment with non-refundable tickets and confirmed reservations. In 8 weeks, I would be sitting in an airplane, flying toward a future I'd thought was permanently out of reach. The secret felt enormous and fragile, like carrying a soap bubble through a thunderstorm. Every interaction with my family became a potential minefield where the wrong word or expression might reveal what I was planning. I practiced casual conversations in my mind, rehearsing responses to innocent questions about work schedules and summer plans that might accidentally expose my deception. My parents noticed the change in my demeanor immediately, though they interpreted it according to their own expectations rather than the reality of what was happening. "You seem energetic lately," my mother observed one evening as I enthusiastically reorganized the store's display area. "It's nice to see you so engaged with the business." "Spring fever," I replied, the lie coming easily now that I'd had practice. "Always makes me want to tackle new projects." Aunt Diane was more suspicious, her teacher-trained instincts attuned to behavioral changes that might indicate trouble brewing. She began stopping by the store more frequently, ostensibly to chat about community news but really to study my expressions and listen for clues about what might be causing my improved mood. Madison's been acting different, she mentioned to my father during one of her visits, her voice carrying the concerned tone she'd once used with parents about children who were showing signs of problematic thinking. More restless. Are you sure everything's okay with her? Dad dismissed her worries with the casual confidence of someone who trusted his daughter completely. She's just hitting her stride with the business. All that innovation and hard work is finally paying off. But Aunt Diane wasn't convinced. She'd spent decades identifying students who were planning mischief, recognizing the telltale signs of secret schemes and hidden agendas. My newfound optimism, combined with my increased attention to personal grooming and my sudden interest in international news, triggered her suspicions in ways I hadn't anticipated. The first direct confrontation came 6 weeks before my departure. Date. I was updating our inventory system when Aunt Diane appeared at the counter with her arms crossed and her expression set in the stern lines I remembered from childhood discipline sessions. Madison, I need to ask you something directly, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to extracting confessions from guilty parties. Are you planning something you haven't told your parents about? My heart hammered against my ribs as I met her gaze with what I hoped was innocent confusion. What do you mean? You've been different for months. Secretive. Distracted. You're spending time on that computer doing things that aren't business related. Yesterday, I saw you looking at some foreign website when you thought no one was watching. The accusation was accurate enough to be dangerous, but vague enough that I could deflect it with partial truths. I've been researching new suppliers, learning about international trade practices that might help us compete better with the big box stores. International trade practices, she repeated skeptically. For a hardware store in Millbrook, Minnesota. The world is changing, Aunt Diane. Even small businesses need to think globally now. She studied my face for long moments, searching for cracks in my composure. I'd learned to lie convincingly over the past months, a skill I'd never needed before but had developed out of necessity. The ability to maintain eye contact while stating falsehoods, to modulate my voice to convey sincerity, to arrange my features in expressions of innocent transparency. I hope you're not getting any foolish ideas about leaving, she said finally. This family has invested too much in your success here for you to throw it away on some immature fantasy. The word fantasy triggered an automatic defensive response that I barely managed to suppress. Instead of arguing, I smiled with what I hoped appeared to be affectionate amusement at her unnecessary concerns. Where would I go? I asked, gesturing around the store that had become my entire world. This is my life, Aunt Diane. I'm not going anywhere. The lie tasted bitter, but it achieved its purpose. Her posture relaxed slightly, though suspicion remained in her eyes. She detected something troubling but couldn't identify its exact nature or scope. 4 weeks before departure, the surveillance intensified. Aunt Diane began appearing at unexpected times, catching me off guard when I thought I had privacy to research travel logistics or practice French phrases. She questioned my parents about unusual phone calls, unexplained absences, and changes in my spending patterns that might indicate secret planning. I'm telling you, something's going on with Madison, she insisted during a family dinner where I pretended not to hear their whispered conversation in the kitchen. She's hiding something significant. My mother, ever loyal and trusting, defended me against these insinuations. Diane, you're being paranoid. Madison's the most responsible person I know. If she says she's researching business practices, then that's what she's doing. But Dad was beginning to share Aunt Diane's concerns, perhaps because he recognized in me the same restless energy he'd felt as a young man before family obligations had anchored him permanently to Millbrook. During our inventory session the following week, he broached the subject with characteristic directness. Honey, is there anything you want to talk about? Your aunt thinks you're planning something you haven't shared with us. The moment felt like a crossroads where honesty might have changed everything. If I'd confessed my plans then, explained my longing for travel and my need to experience life beyond the store, perhaps we could have reached some accommodation. Maybe they would have supported my trip, or at least accepted it as a temporary adventure rather than a betrayal of everything they'd built. Instead, I chose continued deception, partly from cowardice and partly from intuitive understanding that they would never willingly let me go. I'm not planning anything dramatic, I said, which was technically true since I considered the trip an exploration rather than a permanent departure. Aunt Diane sees conspiracies everywhere. You know how she gets. Dad nodded, apparently satisfied by this explanation. She means well, but sometimes she forgets you're an adult who can make her own decisions. The irony of his statement would become apparent soon enough. 2 weeks before departure, I made the mistake that would ultimately expose everything. While researching transportation from the airport to my hotel, I accidentally left a browser tab open on the store's computer showing the website for Paris public transportation. Aunt Diane discovered it during one of her unannounced visits, and this time the evidence was too specific to dismiss or explain away. She didn't confront me immediately. Instead, she began her own investigation, checking my desk drawers when I was busy with customers, examining my computer's browsing history during lunch breaks, and even going through my purse when I left it unattended to help load supplies into a customer's truck. The trap was set with characteristic cunning. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Aunt Diane engaged me in casual conversation about current events while secretly monitoring my reactions to specific topics. "Did you see that story about the terrorist attack in Paris last month?" she asked innocently. "Makes you wonder if it's safe for Americans to travel there these days." My involuntary flinch was microscopic but detectable to someone watching for exactly that response. She followed up with seemingly random comments about airline safety, international crime rates, and the foolishness of young people who thought foreign travel was glamorous rather than dangerous. Each comment was a fishing expedition, designed to provoke reactions that would confirm her suspicions. And despite my careful preparation for such interrogations, I wasn't skilled enough to hide every micro-expression, every slight change in breathing or posture that betrayed my emotional investment in the topics she was discussing. By the end of that conversation, Aunt Diane knew with certainty that I was planning to travel to Paris, though she hadn't yet determined when or how. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place over the weekend when she convinced my mother to let her help with some filing at the store, an offer that provided her with unrestricted access to examine my workspace for additional evidence. She found what she was looking for in my desk drawer, a folder containing printed confirmations for flights, hotel reservations, and travel insurance. The dates, destinations, and details of my entire trip laid out in documentary proof that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as misunderstanding. The confrontation came on Monday morning, 3 days before my scheduled departure. I arrived at the store to find my entire family waiting in the back office, my parents looking confused and hurt, Aunt Diane triumphant and vindicated, and the evidence of my deception spread across the desk like exhibits in a criminal trial. "Well, Madison," Aunt Diane said with icy satisfaction, "it seems we need to have a conversation about your travel plans." The moment I'd been dreading for months had finally arrived. My secret was exposed, my plans discovered, and my family united. In their determination to prevent what they saw as a catastrophic mistake that would destroy everything we'd built together, the ultimate test wasn't just whether I would go to Paris despite their opposition. It was whether I had the courage to choose my own dreams over their fears, my own growth over their comfort, my own future over their plans for who I should be. Standing in that office, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world and the evidence of what they considered my betrayal, I realized that this was the moment when everything would change. There would be no going back to the comfortable lie that my sacrifice was temporary, that my dreams could be indefinitely deferred, that keeping everyone else happy was more important than my own fulfillment. The girl who'd once covered her bedroom walls with pictures of the Eiffel Tower was about to find out if the woman she'd become had the strength to fight for the life she'd always wanted. The silence in the office was deafening as I stared at the evidence of my secret planning spread across the desk like accusations. Hotel confirmations, flight itineraries, travel insurance documents, all the careful preparation that had given me hope for months now seemed like evidence of betrayal in the fluorescent light of the store's back room. My mother's face showed the kind of profound hurt that comes from discovering that someone you trust completely has been systematically lying to you. Dad looked more confused than angry, as if he couldn't quite process how his reliable, responsible daughter had been capable of such elaborate deception. But Aunt Diane's expression was pure vindication, the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been dramatically confirmed. 3 days, she said, tapping the flight confirmation with her finger. "You were going to leave in 3 days without telling us. Just disappear to Paris like we don't matter, like this family means nothing to you." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. "I was going to tell you. I just needed to handle the logistics first, make sure everything was covered here at the store." "Handle the logistics?" My mother's voice cracked. "Madison, this isn't a business trip we're talking about. This is Paris, France. You've been planning to leave the country without discussing it with your family." "I'm 26 years old," I said, trying to inject some strength into my tone. "I don't need permission to travel." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Aunt Diane's face darkened, and I could see her shifting into the authoritative mode she'd perfected during decades of dealing with rebellious students. "You absolutely do need to discuss this with your family," she said sharply. "Especially when your decisions affect everyone who depends on you." The store, your parents, the customers who trust you. You can't just abandon your responsibilities for some selfish adventure. It's not abandoning anything, I protested. It's 2 weeks. I've arranged coverage, prepared detailed instructions for suppliers, made sure everything will run smoothly. While I'm gone. 2 weeks in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, don't know anyone, and anything could happen, my father said, his protective instincts overriding his usual reasonableness. Madison, honey, this isn't like you. You've always been so sensible, so thoughtful about consequences. The conversation that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. Voices were raised, accusations were made, and long suppressed. Resentment surfaced on all sides. I found myself defending not just my travel plans but my right to have dreams that extended beyond the borders of Millbrook, while they argued that my obligations to family and community should take precedence over personal desires. You have no idea how selfish this is, Aunt Diane declared, her voice rising to the pitch she'd once used to discipline unruly second graders. We've all sacrificed for this family business. Your parents put their lives into building something stable and meaningful. And now you want to throw it away for some fantasy about living like a tourist in Europe. I'm not throwing anything away, I shot back, years of suppressed frustration finally finding their voice. I'm taking 2 weeks to see something beyond this store, this town, this life that I never actually chose for myself. Never chose? My mother looked as if I'd slapped her. Madison, you've been running this store for 8 years. You've built relationships with suppliers, customers, everyone in the community. How can you say you never chose this? That's when I made the mistake of telling them the complete truth. Because I didn't choose it, I said, my voice gaining strength as the words poured out. I deferred college to help with Dad's recovery. I stayed 1 extra year to help with the transition. And then somehow 8 years passed while I kept waiting for permission to live my own life. The admission created a stunned silence that felt like the aftermath of an explosion. My parents exchanged glances that communicated volumes, surprise, hurt, and a dawning recognition that the daughter they thought they knew had been harboring fundamental dissatisfaction for years. Madison, Dad said quietly, if you were unhappy, why didn't you tell us? Because every time I tried, someone reminded me how much you needed me, how important family loyalty was, how selfish it would be to put my own interests first. I looked directly at Aunt Diane as I spoke, and her face flushed with anger at the implied accusation. Family loyalty isn't selfish, she snapped. It's what separates responsible adults from spoiled children who think the world revolves around their personal entertainment. This isn't about entertainment, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. This is about having a life that belongs to me, not just serving everyone else's expectations and needs. The argument continued for over an hour, covering ground we'd never explored before as a family. They expressed genuine shock at my discontent, having interpreted my competence and dedication as evidence of fulfillment rather than resignation. I tried to explain the difference between being good at something and wanting to do it for the rest of your life, between family loyalty and self-sacrifice, but the fundamental disconnect was unbridgeable. They saw my Paris trip as an impulsive betrayal of everything we'd built together. I saw it as a long overdue attempt to reclaim dreams I'd set aside for too long. They viewed my secrecy as evidence of guilt and wrongdoing. I understood it as necessary protection against the very reaction they were currently demonstrating. The confrontation ended not with resolution but with ultimatums. If you go on this trip, Aunt Diane declared, you're making it clear that this family means nothing to you. That all our love and support and investment in your future has been wasted. And if I don't go, I replied, I'm admitting that my dreams and desires will always be less important than everyone else's comfort and convenience. My parents tried to find middle ground, suggesting compromises that would have satisfied no one. Maybe a shorter trip closer to home. Maybe postponing travel until the store was more stable. Maybe including family members to make the experience safer and more appropriate, but I'd spent 8 years compromising, accommodating, and deferring. The woman who'd once dreamed of walking along the Seine at sunset wasn't interested in a sanitized vacation to Chicago or a delayed trip that might never actually happen. I'm going to Paris, I said finally, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring in my chest. I've planned this trip carefully, I can afford it, and I'm 26 years old. I have the right to make this choice. That's when Aunt Diane played her final card. We'll see about that, she said with a coldness that should have warned me what was coming. The next 2 days passed in a tense standoff. My parents alternated between hurt silence and attempted interventions designed to change my mind. They brought up practical concerns about store management, safety issues with solo female travel, and the financial irresponsibility of spending savings on frivolous adventures. Aunt Diane remained ominously quiet, which should have been more Alarming than her previous accusations and arguments, the morning before my departure, I woke early to complete final preparations. My suitcase was packed, my documents organized, and my detailed instructions for store operations printed and ready for review. Despite the family tension, I felt a sense of anticipation that had been growing stronger each day as my departure approached. That's when I discovered that my passport was missing. I'd checked it the previous evening, confirming that it was in its usual place in my dresser drawer alongside other important documents. But when I reached for it to pack in my carry-on bag, the drawer contained everything except the one item I absolutely needed for international travel. I searched frantically through every possible location, other drawers, boxes of papers, my purse, the car, even areas where I never would have placed something so important. Nothing. The passport had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. That's when I found the note, written in Aunt Diane's distinctive handwriting and placed exactly where my passport should have been. Some dreams are meant to stay dreams. You'll thank me for this someday. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. Not just the theft itself, but the casual arrogance of someone who believed she had the right to sabotage my plans for my own good. The note's condescending tone, suggesting that I would eventually be grateful for this betrayal, revealed a level of control and manipulation that I'd never fully recognized before. I sat on my bed, holding that note and feeling something fundamental shift inside me. For 8 years, I'd accommodated everyone else's needs, accepted everyone else's definitions of what was reasonable and appropriate for my life. I'd convinced myself that this was love, that family meant putting other people's comfort before your own dreams, but this wasn't love. This was theft, manipulation, and a breathtaking assumption that Aunt Diane knew better than I did what was best for my life. My first instinct was rage, pure, clean anger at the violation of my privacy and autonomy. But underneath the anger was something more powerful, absolute clarity about what I needed to do next. I called the passport office, explaining that I had a family emergency requiring immediate travel and needed an expedited replacement. Yes, it was possible. Yes, it would cost extra. Yes, I would need to drive to Minneapolis for an emergency appointment. Yes, my flight would need to be rescheduled, incurring additional fees and complications, but it was absolutely, definitively possible. As I made call after call, to the passport office, to the airline, to my hotel, to travel insurance, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete determination unclouded by guilt or obligation. Aunt Diane's theft had accomplished the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of stopping my trip, it had removed any lingering uncertainty I felt about disappointing people who had never hesitated to manipulate me for my own supposed good. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of paperwork, travel modifications, and careful planning. I arranged for expedited passport processing, rescheduled my flight for 4 days later, and adjusted my hotel reservations accordingly. The extra costs were substantial, but worth every penny for the lesson they represented. That my dreams were valuable enough to fight for, even when fighting meant defying everyone I'd ever trusted. During those 3 days, I maintained complete silence about my emergency passport replacement. My family assumed that the theft had successfully ended my travel plans, that I'd learned my lesson about the impossibility of pursuing dreams that conflicted with family expectations. They were wrong. In the morning I was originally supposed to leave for Paris, I went to work as usual, playing the part of the defeated daughter who had finally accepted her place. Aunt Diane stopped by the store with barely concealed satisfaction, commenting on how much more settled and focused I seemed now that I'd abandoned my unrealistic plans. Sometimes we need disappointment to help us appreciate what we already have, she said with the smug certainty of someone who believed she'd successfully saved me from myself. I smiled and agreed, letting her believe that her manipulation had achieved its intended purpose. Inside, I was counting down the hours until my rescheduled departure, savoring the anticipation of proving that their attempts to control me had not only failed but had strengthened my resolve to live my own life. The morning I actually left for Paris, I was scheduled to open the store as usual. Instead, I left a letter on the counter explaining that I would be gone for 2 weeks, that I'd arranged comprehensive coverage for my absence, and that when I returned, we would need to have a serious discussion about boundaries, respect, and my future role in the family business. Then I drove to Minneapolis, caught my flight, and spent the longest travel day of my life thinking about the difference between family love and family control, between loyalty and self-sacrifice, between dreams deferred and dreams reclaimed. Standing alone in that airplane, watching Minnesota disappear below me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood: complete ownership of my own choices. The cost had been higher than I'd anticipated, not just financial but emotional, requiring me to accept that people I loved were capable of betraying me for what they considered my own good. But as the plane climbed toward cruising altitude, carrying me toward a city I'd dreamed of visiting for 18 years. I knew that no cost was too high for the right to live my own life on my own terms. Paris was waiting, and for the first time in 8 years. So as the video went viral within 6 hours of posting. I hadn't expected that when I hit share on my phone while standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, grinning with the kind of joy that comes from reclaiming something you thought was lost forever. I'd simply wanted to let my family know that their attempts to control my life had backfired spectacularly, that I was exactly where I'd dreamed of being despite their interference, but something about the story resonated with people far beyond my intended audience of 3 increasingly frantic family members back in Minnesota. Comments poured in from strangers around the world who'd faced similar battles between family expectations and personal dreams. Women who deferred their own ambitions for decades. Young people struggling against relatives who confused love with control. Adults who'd been told their dreams were selfish, impractical, or inappropriate for people of their backgrounds and circumstances. Your aunt probably thought she was protecting you, wrote one commenter, but some protection is actually imprisonment in disguise. I needed to see this today, wrote another. I've been making excuses for why I can't pursue my dreams for 15 years. You just reminded me that the only person who can give me permission to live my life is me. The response was overwhelming and completely unexpected. Within 48 hours, my video had been shared thousands of times, inspiring dozens of response videos from people sharing their own stories of breaking free from family control and pursuing long-deferred dreams. Travel bloggers reached out to collaborate. Women's empowerment organizations asked me to speak at events. A literary agent contacted me about writing a book based on my experience, but the most important responses came from home. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd posted the video, displaying dozens of missed calls and increasingly frantic voicemails from my parents and Aunt Diane. I'd turned off notifications after the first day, wanting to experience Paris without the constant reminder of the chaos I'd left behind. On my 3rd evening in the city, sitting in a cafe in the Latin Quarter with a glass of wine and a perfect view of people strolling along the Seine, I finally listened to the messages. My mother's voice progressed from confused to hurt to angry to worried over the course of multiple calls. Madison, what were you thinking? Everyone in town has seen this video. People are calling to ask if we're okay, if you're having some kind of breakdown. Please call us back. Dad's messages were more measured but equally concerned. Honey, we need to talk about this. Whatever problems we have as a family, we should work them out privately, not broadcast them to the entire internet. Come home so we can figure this out together. But it was Aunt Diane's voicemails that revealed the true impact of my public revelation. Her voice shook with what sounded like genuine distress rather than her usual authoritative anger. Madison, you've humiliated this entire family. People are saying terrible things about us online, calling us controlling and manipulative. How could you do this to people who love you? How could you make us look like villains when all we've ever done is try to protect you? The pain in her voice was real, and despite everything she'd done, hearing it made me feel a stab of guilt. I hadn't intended to hurt anyone when I'd shared my story. I'd simply wanted to document the triumph of finally reaching a destination I'd dreamed about for so long, to show that dreams deferred don't always die, but I'd also underestimated the power of social media to amplify personal stories beyond their original context, turning family conflicts into public narratives that strangers could judge and comment on without understanding the full complexity of the relationships involved. That evening, I called my parents from my hotel room overlooking the Marais district. The conversation was difficult but necessary, marked by tears on both sides and a level of honesty our family had never achieved before. We never meant to trap you, my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. We thought you were happy. You were so good at running the store, so respected in the community. We thought this was what you wanted. I know you never meant to hurt me, I replied, watching the lights of Paris twinkle beyond my window. But impact matters more than intention. I spent 8 years of my life waiting for permission to pursue my own dreams, and I finally realized that permission was never going to come. Dad struggled to understand how my success at the store could coexist with such profound dissatisfaction. You never complained, honey. You seemed proud of what you'd built, excited about the innovations you were implementing. I was proud of the work, I explained. But pride and competence isn't the same thing as fulfillment. I can be good at something without wanting to do it for the rest of my life. The hardest part of the conversation was addressing Aunt Diane's theft of my passport. My parents had been genuinely shocked to learn about it, having assumed that I'd simply changed my mind about traveling rather than discovering that my documents had been deliberately hidden. She thought she was protecting you, Mom said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by this justification. Diane's always worried about family members making decisions that might hurt them. Taking my passport wasn't protection, I said firmly. It was theft and manipulation. The fact that she thought she knew better than I did what was best for my life doesn't make it acceptable. That conversation led to a series of increasingly honest discussions over the following days as I explored Paris, and they processed the reality of how unhappy I'd been without their knowledge. They began to understand that my competence at managing the store had masked rather than expressed my true interests, that my reliability had been built on resignation rather than enthusiasm. Most importantly, they started to recognize the difference between family support and family control, between loving someone and owning them. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Aunt Diane took longer to accept responsibility for her actions, initially defending her theft as tough love, designed to prevent me from making a mistake I would later regret. But as the days passed and I sent photos of my adventures in Paris, visiting the Louvre, exploring Montmartre, sitting in sidewalk cafes reading French literature, even she began to understand that my trip wasn't the disaster she'd predicted. "You look happy," she admitted during one of our video calls, her tone carrying a mix of surprise and reluctant approval. "Different than I've seen you in years." She was right. I did look different, and more importantly, I felt different. The woman exploring Paris bore little resemblance to the resigned store manager who'd been going through the motions of contentment back in Millbrook. Here, surrounded by art and history and the energy of a city that had inspired dreamers for centuries, I was reconnecting with aspects of myself that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten they existed. I spent hours in the Musée d'Orsay, studying Impressionist paintings that had only existed in books during my childhood research. I walked the same streets where Hemingway and Fitzgerald had lived and written, feeling connected to a tradition of people who'd chosen creativity and adventure over security and predictability. I practiced my French with patient cafe owners and shopkeepers who seemed genuinely pleased to help an American visitor navigate their language and culture. Most revelatory was discovering that I could travel alone without disaster befalling me. All the fears my family had expressed about solo female travel, getting lost, being taken advantage of, falling victim to crime or accident, proved to be manageable concerns rather than insurmountable obstacles. I navigated the metro system, asked for directions when confused, and handled minor complications with growing confidence. Each successful day of independent travel in a foreign country was evidence that I was more capable than my family had assumed, more resilient than they'd given me credit for, more deserving of autonomy than they'd been willing to acknowledge. The business opportunities that emerged from my viral video were unexpected but significant. Several companies reached out about consulting work related to family business management and work-life balance. A travel website offered to sponsor additional trips in exchange for documented content about solo female travel. Most intriguingly, a cultural exchange organization contacted me about developing programs for adults who wanted to pursue international experiences they deferred due to family obligations. These opportunities represented possibilities I'd never considered when I'd been focused solely on hardware retail in rural Minnesota. My combination of business experience, language skills, and first-hand understanding of family dynamics created a unique profile that had value in markets I'd never known existed. On my final day in Paris, I sat in the same cafe where I'd first listened to my family's voicemails, reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed in just 2 weeks. The woman who'd arrived in France had been escaping from something: family control, small-town limitations, dreams deferred too long. The woman preparing to return home was moving toward something: new possibilities, authentic relationships, a future built on her own choices rather than other people's expectations. I filmed one final video, this time from the steps of Sacré-Cœur in Montmartre, with the city of Paris spread out below me in the golden light of late afternoon. 2 weeks ago, I stood in front of the Eiffel Tower and told the world that my aunt had tried to stop me from coming here by hiding my passport. I began, my voice steady and confident in ways it had never been during the years I'd spent accommodating everyone else's needs. I want to end this trip by talking about what I've learned, not just about Paris but about the difference between family love and family control. The response to this second video was even more powerful than the first, shared widely by people who recognized their own struggles in my story. But more importantly, it marked the completion of a transformation that had begun with Mrs. Patterson's birthday gift and culminated in my willingness to choose my own happiness over everyone else's comfort. When I returned to Minnesota, I found a family that had spent 2 weeks confronting uncomfortable truths about their role in constraining my dreams. The store was running smoothly under my parents' management, proving that my presence, while helpful, had never been as essential as we'd all believed. They'd hired a part-time employee to handle some of the technical systems I'd developed, and they discovered that running the business without me was challenging but entirely manageable. More significantly, they'd spent time reflecting on the difference between supporting my success and defining my life according to their vision of what was appropriate or safe. "We owe you an apology," Dad said during our first family dinner after my return. Not just for not supporting your trip, but for not recognizing how unhappy you were for so long. The apology was meaningful, but what mattered more was the behavioral change that followed. When I announced my decision to reduce my hours at the store to pursue consulting work and additional travel, they supported rather than sabotaged my plans. When I expressed interest in taking French language classes at the community college, they encouraged rather than questioned my commitment to impractical interests. Most importantly, when I decided to spend 3 months in France the following year as part of a cultural exchange program, they celebrated my acceptance rather than arguing about the business implications of my absence. Aunt Diane's transformation took longer and was never complete, but she did eventually acknowledge that her theft of my passport had been wrong regardless of her motivations. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment, she admitted during a conversation 6 months after my return. I didn't understand that preventing disappointment meant preventing growth. The store continued to thrive under a new management structure that didn't depend entirely on my presence. My parents discovered that they were more capable than they'd assumed, and the part-time employee we'd hired brought fresh perspectives that improved our operations in unexpected ways. Most importantly, the business became a family enterprise rather than a family obligation, something we all contributed to rather than something that consumed my entire identity. The consulting work I developed grew into a substantial secondary career focused on helping family businesses navigate transitions and conflicts between generations. My experience with both successful business management and personal autonomy gave me unique insights into the challenges faced by families where professional and personal relationships intersect, but perhaps most significantly, I learned that choosing yourself doesn't mean abandoning everyone else. The healthy boundaries I'd established actually strengthened my relationships with my parents and improved our collaboration at the store. When I stopped sacrificing my dreams to meet their expectations, they stopped taking my contributions for granted and started appreciating them as choices rather than obligations. 3 years later, I was sitting in a different Parisian cafe, this time as a resident rather than a tourist, working on a book about family dynamics and personal autonomy while preparing for my next consulting assignment with a family business in Lyon. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Saw your latest blog post about business transitions. Very proud of you. Store's doing great, but we miss having you around every day. The message captured perfectly how our relationship had evolved. They were proud of my success rather than threatened by my independence. They missed my daily presence but respected my need to build a life beyond the boundaries of small-town retail. Most importantly, they'd learned to love the person I actually was rather than trying to reshape me into the person they thought I should be. As I typed my response, miss you too, but so grateful for the support to pursue this path. I reflected on how much had changed since that desperate morning when I discovered my missing passport and Aunt Diane's condescending note. The girl who'd once covered her bedroom walls with pictures of the Eiffel Tower had grown into a woman living in the shadow of that same tower, building a career that combined her business skills with her passion for international experiences. The dreams that had once seemed impossible were now simply another Tuesday in a life built on her own terms. Sometimes the people who should see you most clearly are blinded by their own fears about what's safe, what's appropriate, what's realistic. For someone of your background and circumstances, breaking free from those limitations requires courage, but the cost of remaining invisible to yourself is always higher than the price of disappointing others. My family had missed my graduation from constraint to freedom, but they'd been present for every milestone since. And that, I realized, was what healthy family love actually looked like: supporting someone's growth rather than preventing it, celebrating their choices rather than controlling them, trusting their judgment rather than substituting your own. The world was vast and full of possibilities, and for the first time in my adult life, I was free to explore all of them. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.